MBTI
Okay,
authenticity and personal
and
growth. What do you mean by
yeah.
authenticity?
So, authentic expression of the self, in whatever capacity it might be. I don't mean necessarily creative expression, but if you're an SP doing it in an arena which suits SP skills, attributes, aptitudes, etc., and then extending that into SJs, NTs, NFs, um, and whatever they're good at, whatever they're actually naturally, innately supposed to be doing with themselves, as opposed to what they think they should be doing with themselves based upon conditioning, adaptation, etc., etc.
Well, when you said authentic MBTI or MBTI authenticity, I assumed that was kind of a connected term, like you're referring to the authenticity of the expression of the type versus,
Mm.
say, finding optimization via particularist means. Now, from my perspective, I think most people need to learn a lot about cognitive functions and then they can put them away. But the reason I believe that to be the case is because it frames how you interpret your own processing of things so that you're more you have more choices than you
Mm-hmm.
otherwise would.
Yeah, what I'm talking about is this. I was actually thinking of doing my own video, but it's good that we're actually speaking now. What I'm talking about this is to do with there being an underlying pattern of the self, and there being an overlying expression of the self, and basically this like nature and nurture in effect, and to do with the underlying pattern, what's inherent in the self. It might have been rewarded or not rewarded as a child, leading to a distortion of like actually the gestalt of the self, like the whole of the self, and a true expression of the self. So both nature and nurture working together like well, smoothly, etc., as opposed to being slightly distorted. And yeah, that's where my mind was going to do with sort of like the difference between that pattern and that expression, and with that, the difference between what's innate and what a person may think themselves to be, or like create an artifice of who they think they are and mistype as a result on the MBTI, predicated upon either like childhood experiences or what they think society values, or um, traumas or grip states and all of that sort of stuff.
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way. I think it's indicative of an NISI difference between us. I tend to think of the self as being thrown into the world
Mm.
unprepared, as I guess it's Heidegger says, maybe it's one of those philosophers, and as a consequence that you're thrown in with kind of like a set of tools
Mm-hmm.
and a self-defining operational matrix that interacts with data points coming in.
Mm-hmm.
You're constructing a self as you go. You're making important decisions before you know what any of the rules are,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think mostly what you do is kind of remove remove the bad thinking, um, but I don't see there being a true self that you can return to, which seems to be
Mm-hmm.
implied by your visualization. I would say
Yeah.
it's more like a an optimal self is one that's not encumbered by behavioral limitations, basically.
Right. That's interesting. Um, so where my mind goes to as I'm listening to you is to do with that original substance. So if I've heard you correctly, you were saying something along the lines of you're born with certain tools, and then you're constructing as you go along. You're making decisions even before you know that you're making decisions, and that's framing or developing a schema of self, which then is constructed into the world and into your narrative and into the timeline of you, a bit like Facebook, and how you start at point X, and then whatever the timeline evolves to be or emerges to be, so be it. Have I heard you correctly?
Hmm. It's an interesting analogy, the Facebook one. Yeah, more or less. I guess I'd say that I see the self as being comprised of narratives almost entirely, and the
Mm,
narratives progress and interlink. So the further along you get in your narrative build, and the more metacognitive you get, you
mm,
start to work backwards and repurpose things.
mm,
So stuff from the past will link into some new thing that will then make that thing from the past a step on this path that's in this narrative here. Whereas
mm-hmm.
previously it just didn't really have definition.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing with that, and I want to go back to one point, which is to do with what is the original substance. I'll come back to that in a second. But what I'm hearing as I'm listening to you is, it seems like quite an NE approach, so extroverted, intuitive, associational approach of emerging in the moment, linking, associational, bringing in, bridging, etc., 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 and that the self isn't of itself created in that associational bridging way of being. So that's you as an ENTP. That sounds very, very congruent with you and what I'd imagine maybe perhaps other any DOMs actually see the self as.